Evil spirits wake up at midnight, or maybe someone else. Darkness. My heart is pounding. You're trying not to breathe and not to move. You hope they won't find you. Footsteps are heard in the corridor. Something is walking around the apartment, checking every room. You're his target, and it's better not to imagine what will happen when he finds you. The door to the room opens with a nasty creak. Someone comes into the room. In the dark, it can be seen as a big shadow. Shadow has a knife from the kitchen in his hand. Its blade sparkles, reflecting the light of the moon. The window is not completely curtained, and you can see that it is now a full moon. Not a single cloud covers the moon in the sky. Midnight. The time when evil spirits hunt people. Or the shadow goes to the closet and opens the doors, but you're not there. You're sitting behind a huge bed, not making a sound, and praying that he's gone. Fear squeezes the lungs, not letting you breathe. The shadow turns away from the closet and is about to leave the room, when suddenly, her head turns unnaturally in your direction. Two blue eyes sparkle, and in an instant he is in front of you. You don't even have time to scream. As the knife sticks out in your heart, you see death. Her cold fingers penetrate through the body into the soul, pulling it out of the body. Death grins, waves his scythe, and the whole world disappears. It remains only darkness. Mark calmly removes the knife from the body. The corpse crumbles to dust, and the guy frowns with displeasure. Now all this will have to be cleaned up so that the landlord who owns this apartment does not get angry. But that's later. The main thing is that the knife, charmed in the church, works perfectly against evil spirits. Everything went great today. The vile brat, who usually hid in the closet and methodically ate those who rented this apartment, was finally destroyed. Mark smiled. Although the creature was not weak, it was scared just like a child, which greatly facilitated the task. The guy stuck the knife in his bosom and headed to his room. When he got there, he started rummaging in his bag and took out a red lipstick. I remember there is some kind of spirit of Bloody Mary, or, as it is also called, the Queen of Spades. They say this is fiction. Mark looked at his watch. 1200, midnight. It's a great time to wash up. The guy smiled at his thoughts and headed to the bathroom. With red lipstick in her hands. Midnight. The time when evil spirits hunt people. Or, on the contrary. Crazy night. This story happened many years ago. I am a 12-year-old child, go into the country for the summer, and I could not think about what lies ahead of me. It was a rainy summer. I spent the whole of June at home. One evening, my grandmother and I, looking out the window, were waiting for my grandfather, who was in a farm nearby. During the day he grazed cows, and in the evenings he watched the cattle. Unfortunately, Grandpa liked to drink, which was his pernicious passion, so we often waited for his return with anxiety. The rain intensified and persistently knocked on the window. Grandma, stroking my head with a rough hand, went to the stove. Son, can I have some tea? Come on, Grandma. I'll be with gingerbread. All right, honey, she said solicitously. Something is worrying me. I've been spamming badly all night. Bah, everything will be fine. With a sad smile, I turned my gaze back to the window, where the poor dog, hiding in the booth, was looking thoughtfully in front of him, crossing his paws one on top of the other. Hey, Mukhtar. I knocked on the window, trying to attract the dog's attention. Lapierre lazily raised his head and lowered it again, finding no interest in me. Grandma, can I let him in? I asked pityingly. Well, no, we just didn't have enough dirt, the grandmother replied sternly. I hung my head. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening. Grandmother carefully made the bed. I was getting ready for bed. It seems that Grandpa will be drunk again. Looking out the window for the last time, I saw Mukhtar's nose sticking out of the booth and a downpour that had played out in earnest. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up in the middle of the night, I felt a slight tremor and a wet tongue on my cheek. Someone was licking me. It was my dog. Hey, what are you doing here? I whispered in surprise in a half-doze. By the way, Grandfather had a habit of letting the dog into the house when the weather was particularly inclement. One winter, returning home drunk, he opened the door wide. Then it seemed to me that I spent the night with the Snow Queen in the Ice Kingdom. The dog, having run near me, ran away into the darkness. The rain was pounding on the roof. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Barefoot, I stood on the icy floor, feeling the cold in my gut. "Grandma," I called out, barely audible. In response, silence. "Grandma," I repeated a little louder. The house was silent. Usually Grandma's sleep was not so sensitive. Fear began to settle inside me. I stumbled backwards out of excitement and tripped over a stool. There was a crash in the room, as if the cook in the kitchen had fallen and knocked down all the pots at once. It seemed that I would wake up the whole village, but in response there is still silence. Approaching the lamp, I tried to turn on the light, but in vain. "Granny," I called again with tears in my eyes. Tears were choking me and I was one step away from hysteria. Trying to pull myself together, I got dressed and ducked into the next room. Feeling for matches on the dresser, I lit a candle standing next to it. Bright light, illuminating the room, exposed the interior of the room. Everything was in its place. I went to my grandmother's room. When I got close, I pulled the door handle hard and almost tore off my hand. The door was tightly locked. I knocked and leaned my ear against it. Silence. Suddenly, the sound of broken glass was heard inside. In fright, I recoiled and hid behind the stove. The candle went out. Everything was shrouded in darkness again. Shrinking into a ball, I made an attempt to control myself. There was a door creaking, and then heavy footsteps and loud breathing. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Was it human? I don't know. Holding my breath, I began to listen carefully. On the creaking floor, I could hear the sound of footsteps slowly heading into my room. For a moment the stranger stopped, and with him my breathing. It seemed as if he was listening to every rustle. Suddenly, the silence was interrupted by a loud and angry dog barking from the street. With a heavy tread, someone continued his journey and soon left the house, leaving the shelter. I went to look for the lost candle and lit it with shaking hands. I was going back to my grandmother's room. The door was open. In indecision, step by step, I approached. My heart was ready to jump out of my chest. The wind blew through the broken window and extinguished the flames. I stepped into the darkness. Wild and frightening sounds of nature could be heard outside. I took a few more steps into the void, and suddenly, bright lightning filled everything with blinding light. I was speechless with horror. With my mouth wide open, I froze. In front of me was the headless body of my grandmother. Everything was drenched in blood, as if crimson rivers of red wine poured into all the cracks at once. The severed head lay on the floor with its eyes open in horror. I couldn't control myself and fell, hitting the back of my head on something bulky. Barely retaining consciousness, an unknown force helped me get out of there. Knocking down everything in my path, I jumped out into the yard and ran towards nearby houses. A numbness bound my limbs so that I could not utter a word. Running past the gate leading to the village road, I noticed a dead dog. It was Mukhtar. Someone smashed his head in. In horror, I ran away from the house that was once my home. From now on it was a stranger. Quickly mincing my feet, I got confused and tripped over a stone. My gaze was attracted by the grass crushed a few meters away. Getting up and running away, I saw a corpse torn to pieces in that place. "Grandpa," flashed through my head. I was running through the rain on a deserted road. Someone had a light on in the windows. I was drowning in mud, and it mercilessly ate my shoes, barely giving me the opportunity to keep them on my feet. My head was spinning, and at the same time everything was spinning around. Now to the left, now to the right, I saw barely discernible black figures, mocking and teasing. I took a deep breath with all my strength and let out a last and long cry, similar to a howl. Finally, I saw familiar silhouettes in the distance. I recognized them. They were fellow villagers. When I reached them, I collapsed unconscious in front of them. It was a sunny day. I stretched lazily and didn't even open my eyes. The bed was warm and cozy. The clean linen smelled fresh. The rays of the sun shimmered and shone directly into my eyes, and I had to squint to look around the room. How great, I thought. This was my home. Still, I loved the city more than the village. However, The thoughts in my head gradually began to be replaced by the events of last night. My father appeared in the doorway and, with the warmth that is unique to him, smiled and winked at me. My mouth broke into a smile. It seems it was just a dream. I wanted to hug my dad with joy. Jumping up, I tried unsuccessfully to find my slippers under the bed. When I looked up, the figure of a tall man appeared in front of me. He was in a police uniform. It wasn't an easy night. Isn't that right? Hey kid, can you tell us something? Death stares. It was in July last year. At about 5 in the evening, the doorbell rang. I went to the door and asked about the identity of the visitor. The answer to me was a phrase uttered by a familiar voice. Yes, I am. Come on, come out. I put on my sandals, put on my shirt and left the apartment. My old friend Vitya was waiting for me in the stairwell, with whom we had agreed on a walk in the morning. After shaking hands, we headed for the elevator and then leisurely walked to the nearby park. Considering that I live in the northern district of one of the major Russian cities, the reader will probably find it strange that I began to conduct a conversation through the door, and not just look through the peephole. Alas, this is not some kind of accident or whim. Few people use door peepholes in our district, and some even specially cut them out of doors, putting metal or just dirt in patches. The reason for this could look like a stupid superstition, if not for the ambulances that appear so often in the neighborhood, taking either fresh corpses or people who, according to their mental state, are slightly different from them. It's all about our neighborhood. No, we are not located next to an abandoned factory, an ancient cemetery, a boarded-up mental hospital, or a Nazi bunker, which are so often mentioned in the plots of horror films. Secret military laboratories, as well as the shelters of mad scientists. No one noticed either. Such a sad and dangerous neighborhood lies in just one grandmother, which, however, is no less terrifying than all of the above. No one knows her exact place of residence, because few people had the courage to follow her to her apartment. Periodically there are dreamers who claim that the grandmother definitely lives in their house, or even the entrance. But in fact all this turns out to be empty chatter. They see the grandmother often, moreover. People who are not at all inclined to make believe and bragging. For example, they say that they watched her slowly, hobbling and limping, turn a corner, or dragging a squeaky shopping cart, trying to climb a slippery slide in winter. Judging by the descriptions, she is no different from other poor and eccentric old people of Russia, to whom no one has cared for a long time. She is dressed in some cheap monotonous jackets and raincoats, and in the cold season, analogues of a quilted jacket. The lower part of the body is covered either by a long skirt or simply insulated tights with waterproof pants. On the feet flaunt felt boots or ridiculous rectangular shoes made of leatherette and rubber, which you can buy on the market for 300 rubles. The only thing that never changes is her face. More precisely, not the face, but what hides it, the gray, matted down shawl, covered with brown spots, hardened from ingrained dirt and clinging debris. It covers everything from the eyeline and below. Actually, those who saw her without a scarf could not tell about it. Of course, no one could personally guarantee that it was in her face. But the frightening cases of deaths and insanity left no other assumptions. Indeed, if at first a hunched, undersized grandmother in a headscarf is seen spinning around some building, and in the evening doctors take away the body lying right at the entrance threshold of the apartment locked from the inside, what other options can there be? There is a heartbreak, a completely untouched door, and the stories of neighbors who heard the doorbell and a series of knocks from neighbors. How, apart from the fact that these people saw something through a peephole, a keyhole, or a crack of an open door, can all this be explained? Of course, various assumptions were made on this score. Some say that this grandmother is a witch, maddened by rituals. Others, that in her youth she received a severe chemical burn. There are even some who suggest that she is not from this planet. Unfortunately, all these guesses can hardly be called convincing. Even if there are some dark forces, is a disfigured face really the best thing you can get from them? Chemical burns, as well as other injuries, can cause maximum nausea and loss of consciousness in the particularly impressionable, but death. And, of course, why should mysterious beings from other planets live the life of poor Russian pensioners? The old woman's stories that, in her youth, the grandmother must have looked into the forbidden well, and should not be perceived at all otherwise than folklore. In general, in addition to the described detail, there is nothing otherworldly or inexplicable in the grandmother. She sometimes buys dumplings in cardboard boxes, chicken legs and pasta in local stores. She, of course, avoids shopping malls. I must say that, again, according to rumors, when shopping, she does not say a word, just mumbles, beckoning the saleswoman, and points her finger at the goods. She does not move by levitation or turning into animals, but by the usual, slow gait of an old, infirm person. They say that her victims were often those who entered into an ordinary domestic conflict with her. They left garbage there, did not close the entrance door, fed stray dogs, did not take away construction junk in time, and so on. Perhaps I would have left the mysterious deaths and obsessions on the conscience of the popular imagination, if not for that July day from which I began the story. Our walk then very soon turned into a picnic. As in the park, we met former classmates who decided to treat us to kebabs. After the meal, as usual, we discussed acquaintances, history, politics, plans for the future, and other things that make up the content of ordinary friendly conversations. When we decided to go home, it was almost 11 o'clock at night, and darkness finally settled on the street. I must say right away that, unlike my friends, I did not drink anything stronger than Kuss that evening. It's not about any strong beliefs or religious prohibitions, I just don't like the taste of alcohol. When we reached the familiar intersection, Vitya and I shook hands, agreeing the next day at about the same time to go for a run and stretch in the park. The sweltering heat had stopped, so I walked slowly home, enjoying the warm July air. Passing the turn to the next street, I noticed a group of young people who were holding bottles in their hands and arguing noisily about something. Next to them was a car, either a Peugeot or a Renault, apparently belonging to one of them, from the speakers of which music was coming. Having figured out that the guy's musical preferences are limited to Russian gangster rap, I continued my way home, deciding to listen to a couple of tracks of Diablo Swing Orchestra before going to bed. So to speak, for prevention, I had almost disappeared behind the house, following the turn. As the voices of the guys became much louder, assuming that there might be a fight now, I turned around. Of course, I was wrong. No scuffle was planned. Instead, the figure of an old woman in a spring coat, whose face was wrapped in something, was heading towards the guys, shuffling and waving her arms. From afar, it is difficult to say what exactly was being discussed, but it was clear without words. The grandmother expressed her dissatisfaction with loud music, laughter, scattered packets of chips and other snacks, and something else that she pointed out. The guys, as can be assumed, only demonstrated their indifference to her indignation, advising her to go back to where she came from. After about 10 minutes of this altercation, the grandmother stopped waving her hands. Instead, she stopped and slowly began to untangle the handkerchief on her face. Having untied it enough, she abruptly raised her head in the direction of the company. Several people standing closest to her immediately fell, as if they were paralyzed overnight. The third, crying, quietly sat down on his haunches. The latter, apparently guessing what was the matter, threw himself to the ground, pressing his head to the ground with his hands. The grandmother approached the lying man, kicked him a couple of times, mumbled, turned around and began to move away. After walking about 10 meters, she turned around in my direction. In the dark, I could only make out a vague silhouette, which, unfortunately, quickly began to take shape. The worst thing was that I began to look at the face. It seemed, to me, somehow unnaturally elongated, as if the lower jaw went further under the clothes, ending somewhere in the liver area. I was able to notice that something was moving in all parts of the face, and it was pulsating unusually. From all this, the strongest nausea came over me. I looked away from the grandmother and leaned against a tree. The nausea was getting worse. Having finished with an attack of vomiting, After a few minutes I regained the strength to look at what was happening. The grandmother was no longer there. Instead, screaming people began to crowd, apparently trying to figure out what had happened. Despite the extreme shock, I slept very soundly that night. In the afternoon, when I woke up and ate toast with butter, I began to reflect on what had happened, about what would have happened if I had been able to get a better look at the grandmother, about how death will be explained, and I had no doubt that it happened those guys. Finally, about how in general a face can be so stretched, and my thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell. After taking a sip of tea, I headed into the hallway, automatically shouting, "Who's there?" Although it was clear that it was Vitya. I had already made one turn of the castle, when suddenly it dawned on me that it was only 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and Vitya and I had agreed for the evening. And then, no one responded to the question. I asked again, "Who's there?" But the answer to me was only a strangled moo and some slurp.